opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not represent or reflect the official policy or position of the Take a Paycheck Foundation and podcast. All information shared is from personal experiences and does not constitute medical advice. We do not take responsibility for any statements expressed during the podcast. Take a Paycheck does not endorse any products or services. Any said products or services mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you or your condition. Please consult with your physician if you have medical questions, as it may pertain to your condition.
Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's episode on Take a Paycheck. I'm so excited to have Sharona joining me today. Hi Sharona, can you give me a brief introduction about yourself? Tell me a little bit about your career, your hobbies, and what you've been up to recently.
Hi, my name's Sharona Franklin. I live in Merritt, BC right now on the stolen unceded territories of the Nalaka, Pamuks, and Syilx people. I'm an artist and advocate, and I write as well. I specialize in sculpture mostly, so I make textile sculptures, gelatin sculptures, quilts, paper mache, and I also do some publishing, design, all sorts of stuff like that. But most of my work is in the kitchen, really.
That sounds so interesting. And I'm like looking at your background right now and I see a lot of tools.
I have a lot of tools. I've got tons, and I have tons of foraged herbs. I use a lot of foraged things and found objects, and I use a lot of recycled materials.
So you are on this podcast because you have a rheumatic disease, maybe multiple rheumatic diseases and conditions.
So I have systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis, which is in some places known as Still's disease, and I have juvenile ankylosing spondylitis. But I had what they called undifferentiated. So I'm mostly treated for Still's disease or systemic arthritis. But undifferentiated means I had symptoms of a lot of different rheumatic conditions like Behçet's syndrome. I had inflammatory bowel disease, psoriatic symptoms, all sorts of different stuff.
Wow, that's a lot. And when were you diagnosed with SJIA?
I wasn't diagnosed until I think it was 6th grade. So I was about 11, and I was born quite ill, and they thought that it was all sorts. I had some lung and heart problems and skin conditions, and they thought that it was all kind of separate. They thought that I had like this heart condition and allergies. I couldn't like eat any food, have formula, babies like milk, nothing. And then it was like a little bit better from the ages of, I would say like 6 to 9. And then it got really bad. Like all my joints swelled up like water balloons. They thought I had scarlet fever at that time because I had like a super high fever and a rash. And scarlet fever is actually part of the periodic fever syndromes, which like systemic arthritis is as well. It's an autoinflammatory condition. So they thought I had scarlet fever, and then they thought I had like all these wild infections because my blood counts were so high. And then they finally diagnosed uveitis. But it was actually it was a locum. It was a visiting doctor because I lived in rural BC. So it was like really hard to find doctors.
So we'll get into that soon. But did it take you a while to get a diagnosis? I know that you mentioned that there were some complications there and it was kind of hard, but what kind of led you to see a doctor?
I went to a friend's house once in about like 6th grade, I think, and I was wearing a long sleeve shirt and a hoodie, and I took my hoodie off, and my arm was so swollen that my shirt was like swelled into it. Like I couldn't get my shirt removed. I couldn't take it off. So I went to a walk-in clinic. Like a few different times I kept going to the ER and walk-ins, and they thought I had like sprained joints or infected joints because they were so swollen. And then they eventually did a arthrocentesis. They like take these big needles and they remove all the fluid from the joints, and then they basically like biopsy the fluid or whatever. So when they did that, they did all these cortisone injections, and then they put me on like tons of steroids, high dose steroids, and like Plaquenil and sulfasalazine and methotrexate, and just kind of gave me like every medicine they could. And yeah, so I have had like multiple diagnoses since then. I actually think I was looking into some of my medical history, and I was in the ER think it was 16 times in the first 2 years of my life. Yeah, so they like my parents didn't know what was happening and they would bring me there. But I don't think anyone in my life suspected that um, there was like a chance for me to have like serious diseases like these. I don't think anyone had really heard of that for such small children. And then like when I was in the youth system, it was really hard. I already had these diagnoses, but by the time I was like 12, 13, I was pretty much full time in the youth system. Whereas when I was a kid, my family struggled with like addiction and mental illness. So I always had social workers and lawyers and kind of these like negotiators in my life, but I primarily lived at home. I think also it was difficult to get a diagnosis because I was one of eight children. So there was just like a lot going on. And these like trips to the ER or whatever, they would kind of result in nothing. And I would kind of just be like, oh, okay, I guess I'm fine or whatever. But eventually there was a doctor that came through BC to the town I was living in. And I just so happened to see her one day and she was like, oh, I know exactly what this is. So it was interesting.
I mean, it's good in a way that now you know what's going on with you, but there must have been a lot of hurdles that you kind of mentioned that kind of led you to that diagnosis. So you did mention that you lived in a rural environment. So how did that impact the diagnosis journey?
So one of the towns that I lived in didn't have any doctors whatsoever. I lived 15 minutes out of this town called Lumby, and Lumby only had like I think it was like 1,500 people, no library, nothing. So even just to get to a hospital or walk-in clinic, it was like a 40-minute drive. So it just really wasn't something that people did regularly in that town. And I lived between multiple small towns. My parents were divorced, so I traveled between multiple towns my whole childhood until I was in the youth system. And then I just stayed in Vernon mostly, which is another small city or whatever. I think like once I had a diagnosis, it was really difficult because I wasn't near BC Women and Children's Hospital. So I basically went to Penticton or Kelowna or sometimes Vancouver, but I would have to take like buses by myself. When I was emancipated, I had to take buses by myself and I would have to like go through my social workers to get letters for my teachers at school and then get my social workers to get like special approval to send me on buses to miss school to go to the doctor and stuff.
That sounds so
It
complicated.
was
Like,
really intense and like super isolating, right? Because the experience of having disability as a child and taking so many medications is really intense as it is. And then when you have to like go to multiple regions to see doctors by yourself and like miss school and explain to students what you're doing, like it was really surreal, especially when it was like winter time and stuff and I was taking greyhounds. Like the greyhound buses are canceled now here in BC, but back then my social workers would like buy me these greyhound tickets and send me to these other towns by myself.
and how old were you when this was happening?
I was about like, I wasn't super young. I was like 13, 14,
That
15.
is young. That is young because like I was diagnosed at 13 with JIA, and like when I think of if I were to be on like a bus alone going to appointments, I don't know what I would do.
Yeah, it was really intense. And like, I will say that the clinic that I went to at Penticton, there weren't other children there, even though they did like a locum clinic. Whereas when I heard more about um, kids who went to the BC Women and Children's, they like had more of a community, it seemed, and they got to meet other people. Like I didn't really meet anyone else with rheumatic disease. I did go to the arthritis camp in Capilano when I was 12, but again, it was like very parental focused. Like your parents would sign you up and your parents would drive you there. And I remember I had a social worker who helped me get into that program. But then after I like no longer lived with my guardians, I just like didn't want to go to camp or anything because it was pretty difficult to explain to people my home life and my living circumstances already. And then like going to a kids camp and explaining that, I just felt pretty like isolated. And I didn't want to, yeah, I just didn't want to explain how I lived. So I kind of just like immediately grew up. Like I was kind of just like an instant adult at like 12 or 13.
Yeah, it sounds like you matured very quickly, and I'm wondering if you're comfortable. Do you want to expand a little bit more about what your living and home situation was like so more people can
Yeah,
relate to what it was?
there was a lot of turmoil and mayhem. I mean, there was a lot of cool stuff. Having tons of siblings was really cool. We're a lot of us live in different cities, so we don't see each other much. And there was a lot of trauma though, and really difficult things that we all went through. And yeah, like a lot of my siblings actually struggle with illness themselves, and some of them have been diagnosed with rheumatic diseases. Some of them have like non-diagnosis where they don't know what's going on. I mean, it's complicated because on one hand, like I want to give a lot of details and I want to advocate for youth in care and some of the more like specific things that we experience. But on the other hand, like my siblings are all in different places with their way of healing. So sometimes it's hard because I want to speak about things, but then it comes back to them where they're like, oh, Sharona, I wish you wouldn't have told people about this. Like, I don't want people knowing because we have the same, like in our hometown, people know that we're siblings. So when I speak out publicly, it affects them. Dealing with mental illness and addiction in my life, in my family, it really impacted me. And like, I dealt with mental illness and addiction from a very young age. And I think dealing with chronic pain from a very young age that also impacted it because like I wasn't overprescribed pain meds or anything like that, but I was given pain meds like pretty young. And I was also looking for my own methods of pain management. And I think too, like when you're living on your own or you only have social workers to talk to who aren't trained in disability, you just want like any type of relief. Like I drank so much when I was young. I don't anymore.
You did mention a little bit about youth in care. I'm wondering if you could explain what a youth agreement program is and how did it work for you?
So yeah, a youth agreement program is an agreement with basically the Ministry of Child and Family Development. And it's where they usually put people in the youth agreement if they think that you're safer on your own than with guardians. Like I lived with family members a lot and kind of like moved around when I was a kid. And then when I was 12, I was like living with friends, like school friends, families. And I've thought about that a lot because I think if I didn't have these illnesses, I probably would have just stayed living with my friends' families. But they would be like, Sharona, you're so great. Like, I want you to have a safe home. I want you to feel comfortable. You should come live with us. But then I think it was a lot for them because they didn't realize that I took all these medications. I did self injections or I'd have to go to the hospital a lot. So, like, before I was on a youth agreement, I was kind of like living with random people. And that was really hard because I was supposed to go into a group home for like a youth group home, but I really didn't want to. So like on one hand, like I didn't feel comfortable going into a group home because of my like physical barriers and my fatigue and having PTSD and taking like all these medicines. I mean, I found that even when I went to friends' houses for the night, their parents would be like suspicious of my meds. And especially back then when there was no internet, like now I can be like, oh, this is Plaquenil or oh, this is methotrexate, and they can just Google it and it's like a done deal. They believe me. But back in like 1999, 2000, you say that to an adult and they're like, where did you get this? Why do you have this? What's going on? And it really like scared them. And I think a lot of my friends' parents too, they didn't want to be accountable for something that they didn't understand. And
Yeah.
they didn't feel like it was their place to take me to the hospital and stuff like that. So, yeah, so my doctors and my social workers kind of all agreed that me being on my own was actually fine because I'd been managing myself for so long, anyways. So basically, the youth agreement, it makes the government your guardian. It's kind of like back then it's different. Back then it was like child welfare essentially, where like you get $500 a month to live for like all your food, all your utilities, all your rent, all your school supplies, like literally everything. Yeah, so I got really good at budgeting. It was really like not very much. They changed it though because they were finding that like the death rates for youth in care were 5 times the rate of non-youth in care.
Wow.
So youth in care were like 500% more likely to die during that age period. And so they've done like a big overturn of the youth in care system now. And they give like, it's not a lot, but I think they've increased the monthly allowance threefold. I think it's close to like 1,500 now. And then they have other programs now, like they offer driver's lessons, which we didn't get that. They offer, subsidies for technology and phone plans and internet plans and grocery subsidies. And whereas back then it was just like you got I think it was like $550 a month and you were responsible for everything in your life on your own. And now they also have they have Aged Out Youth, which is a really cool program, and they send emails every month. I'm actually subscribed just because I'm so like I want to still see what they're doing with these programs and how far they've come. So yeah, they send out like um bursary info or even like coupons. They'll be like, apply and get this like grocery coupon, and then there's like cooking classes and arts classes and all sorts of stuff like that. But I think it's just in general, it's easier to coordinate now with these types of like email and all that. Like back then, you would have had to like give each youth like a pamphlet and be like, show up at this place at this time,
Yeah,
you know?
it sounds
But
like that.
yeah, but then also, so youth in care used to age out at 19. Um, and now they've extended that. So, because they were also finding that the death rates, suicide, and addiction rates for youth in care were just so high, the youth in care who are aging out. Um, so then they extended that and they've like been reducing a lot of these rates. There's a few cool studies I wrote them down. There's one by Andrew Armitage called Lost Vision, and it goes through a bit of the history of youth in care. And then there's Something to Look Forward to, which is kind of dark, but it's the BC Coroners Service. They actually put out this publication because the BC coroners were finding these like extremely high rates. And then, yeah, there's a few articles. There's one by Laurie Colbert in the Vancouver Sun. And this one cites that approximately 780 youth age out in BC each year, which isn't a lot. Like it's a pretty small population. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. Like because it's a small population, I feel there's a lot that people can do to help. But then because it's been such a small population, it hasn't been widely discussed or recognized.
Yeah, I feel like I'm also learning so much. Like I know that this exists, but I don't know the nitty-gritty or like the details of it. And it's just so important because you were not only dealing with a chronic illness, but you were dealing with other things in your life. So,
On one side of my family, the four older siblings, they all left home around like 13 or 14.
okay.
But they were all, one of them graduated high school, but they were all like anarchists and punks. So they were, and like hippies. They were all makers. Like two of them made like hot sauce and bongo drums and painted and made jewelry. And then one of them was like living off grid. He left home at like 13, went and lived off grid. And then he started a honeybee farm. Um, and then one of them actually passed away. She robbed a bank. She was like an armed bank robber, and she was my I was really close with her. She was an artist, and she went to jail underage, and then she passed away. She overdosed after prison, and most of my older siblings, they didn't age out. They weren't in the youth system. They just kind of like left home. And one of my older brothers too, like he just started working really young. I think that's something that's interesting too, is like we all worked so young. We cleaned houses, We cleaned like law offices. We worked at an auto body shop. Our stepdad had this auto body shop. So like we would get off school, go to the auto body shop, like prep cars. Me and my brother like painted the sign for the auto body shop. I would like take the before and after pictures of all the cars and make like collages and stuff. But yeah, so my older siblings, they just left home really young. And then my younger siblings, they kind of bounced around, but I was the only youth that was like fully in the youth system. Because I think because I was high risk, because of my illnesses, and my family really struggled to manage or be part of that, um, with everything else that was going on in their lives. So yeah, I think like I was pretty high need compared to my other siblings. They are all dealing with different illnesses and like mental health issues now later in life, but back then they weren't really dealing with like disability related issues. Some of the frustration my parents had towards me was because of my disabilities, and just like I think I'm even imagining like as a baby they were always just like you couldn't eat, they were just like frustrated, you know. I think they were really frustrated with me because I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't like, I wasn't just like normal, you know, where my other siblings, they kind of could do things normally a bit more.
And that must have been really tough for you also. I mean, you were really young, but to like digest that in a way that you were being treated a little bit differently because of your conditions.
Yeah, I internalized so much. Like, I remember when I was really little, I thought I was sick. I just used the word sick. I was like, I had trouble eating. I was really, really skinny. I was like, I had trouble digesting things. I didn't really understand it, right? Like when you're a kid, you just don't feel well and you don't know what that means. But I remember like, I think it played a big part in why I got diagnosed so late, because I also just didn't feel safe talking about how I felt, where like it took my disability becoming so visible. Like everyone in the school, my teachers, my friends' parents, everyone was like, what is going on with your body? Because it was so visible. I think for a lot of kids, when they have a safer place to talk about their pain and their feelings, then they're taken a bit more seriously sooner. And when I was diagnosed, I was in denial for so many years. Like I would tell people, but it was very like hush hush. Um, and I didn't, even though like in school and stuff, I was recognized as disabled. I was taken out of like field trips, and I couldn't do sports and all this stuff. I had to like watch the other kids do sports, which was torture. Because I loved sports. Like before my joints were super bad, I loved sports, and then they made me like sit in the classes and watch. Like I just had to sit there. I was like, let me go draw.
Yeah, it's like, let me do something else. So, but the thing is, for me, for example, like they made me do yoga stretches on the side, and I'm like, that's worse.
Oh, yeah, that would have sucked. That's what they did with you?
Yeah, they were like, okay, so you can't do volleyball or basketball, do yoga stretches on the side. But some people like actually get exempted from gym class. And I'm like, why was that? Or they take another like leadership course or something else or
Yeah.
do assignments. And I'm like, why was that not offered to me? Like that needs to be more standardized.
Yeah, that wasn't offered to me either. It's so interesting thinking of how we all navigated, because we were in different school systems too, but yeah, they really didn't have like any adaptations for like I had special chairs in my classes. Did you have that?
Yeah. No,
It was like,
actually, in high school, I used the same chair as everyone. In university, they gave an option of like if I wanted to use a special chair, but I mean, I only needed it for my labs, but I haven't needed it for actual in-class chairs because it's more like a movie theater seat, and I'm okay with it. So they
mhm.
have options now in university, but in high school, I just had the same chair as everyone else, and I was okay with it. Like I didn't feel any pain, but I imagine for you might have been different.
It's so weird because in high school, I had an occupational therapist who like came to school, and they basically just had like an obis form. or the back that they like put on different chairs. But then when I went to university, they didn't. Like when I went to university, I didn't have any adaptation. Like I tried to ask for a chair because a lot of the sculpture labs, sculpture studios, they have like 20 students and 10 chairs. And
Oh.
so the teachers would be like, just take a chair and keep it. But I also can't sit for a super long time. Like we have to like stretch. So I'd get up and students would take it and be like, you weren't using it. And like they didn't understand. I just like literally got up for like 1 second. It was really not a nice vibe. But yeah, for some reason when I went to Emily Carr, that's the school I was talking about. They didn't provide, like I was explaining, I can't sit on a backless stool, and they were just like, oh, you should just like go home until you feel better. But I dropped out. Like I couldn't. I just was like, I can't. I just will be an artist instead. You know.
And do you think your passion for art kind of came from escaping in a way
For sure.
from what was actually reality? Like I'm assuming that your passion from art came from escaping what was reality.
It's so nice that you asked that, because as a person, like as you deal with arthritis and rheumatic diseases, it's really interesting you ask that, because most people think that it's catharsis, and it's not. It's escapism for sure. For non-disabled people, they always think it's catharsis, and they think that I'm releasing my pain through my art, but it's actually kind of the opposite, where I'm like deleting it and just like ignoring it and just thinking of other things. I think for you, as a person who's coping with pain as well, you just like immediately get it. But most people don't think it's escapism. So it totally is. It's like a fantasy world.
That's a big thing for us. It's like we deal with the pain, but in order for us to like escape the pain, we do things that we're really passionate about or like love doing. Like for me, that's singing or listening to music. And for you, it's art. And you've made that your career now to make you even like feel better. And I feel like a lot of the things that you mentioned in terms of your life and how a lot of your siblings also were artistic in a way and did different things to express themselves. Like it sounded like a lot of you used this as a way to escape.
For sure. It was also, yeah, it was escapism. And then I think we always thought that we would have to take care. You know, there was no like trust fund, and none of us were ever told to go to university, or there was just, I think yeah, I'm the first generation university or college student in my family. My younger sister went to school too. But so I think we always thought like, oh, it was kind of tied to trades, right? Where my brother, he makes boats, but he also is a musician and he's an actor. He sings, he's done theater. But yeah, for him too, like he's been able, like he used to make dune buggies as a kid and all these types of things. So he worked in auto shops, and then he moved on to boats. But like his creativity is also tied to his career. And I think that's what's really interesting about trades, like welding, all these types of trades. They're actually just sculpture. So like you can do a little bit of both, I think, and find a way. Like for me, it was baking. I baked since I was super young. And then I worked in a bakery in my early 20s, but it was like so painful. Like I went in with my arm braces. I was all braced up, my back braces, I was all braced up. But the thing, it was really cool because I worked by myself at that bakery. I worked at night. They were like, do you want to work these shifts? And I was like, no, can I just work when nobody's there? So I worked between like midnight to 4 a.m. or sometimes 3 a.m. to like 5 or 8 a.m. And I would go in there at night by myself, but it was great because I could like lift things the way I needed to, right? Like if there's people around, you want to lift things like this and be all like formal. But for me, like I would like shove things and like prop things, and I would always use a stool, and I would kind of do things my way, which maybe looked a little bit funny to a classic baker, classically trained baker. But that's kind of, yeah, I baked a lot. And then now I work with gelatin, which is like, that's kind of transferred over from baking.
And you mentioned a lot of like baking and painting and sculpting. So I'm wondering like what joints are impacted. Like I'm
Yeah.
assuming maybe not your hand joints, or maybe they are and you're just pushing through.
Yeah, my hand joints are pretty bad. A lot of it's actually my shoulders and my spine. Like most all of what I do sitting. Um, but even yeah, like so I sometimes I'll like prop my elbow up and then just like pivot it because I have quite a bit of upper body weakness from damage in my C spine. So I can lift things like say like a book. I can like lift it from here to there most of the time, but sometimes I just like will drop things a lot because I'll lose strength really fast, like faster than usual. Um, so yeah, there's like a couple things. There's like the issue with the weakness, and then I tremble a lot from my spine issues. So there's a bit of shakiness. So a lot of times I'll hold my right arm with my left arm, and I actually have like a special strap that I use on this arm, and it helps stabilize the fingers, like from shaking and twitching and stuff. But yeah, I use like so many different adaptive things, and I find now I have to have an assistant in the studio, like because I can't lift very much, and I can't do repetitive, like even lifting something that's 1 pound like 10, 20 times. It's really hard on the elbows, the shoulders, the wrists. So I have a studio assistant that like helps move things around. But
That's
it's super funny because people here like most professional artists have studio assistants who don't have disability, and then when you have disability people are like, but can you do it yourself? Are you the one making it? Like I'm like, yeah, I'm the one making it. Like they're
wow.
just moving things around the room.
Yeah, that's crazy. Like I can't believe you have to deal with such comments like that because like you are still getting what you need to be done. It's just in a different way.
It's yeah. I really want to film my production because I think what people imagine it might look like is actually super different.
And so it must have been very difficult to feel stable somewhere when you were constantly moving around in your childhood. How did it feel actually being displaced from your roots in Okanagan?
It was interesting because I part of me really wanted to move to a city. I was like dying to go somewhere fun and be around more artists. Yeah, I like got this letter from GF Strong just saying like, "Hey, we have you enrolled in this program. You're going to be coming here." And I really didn't know that I would be like moving to Vancouver. Like I thought I was just going to go to this hospital for a few months and kind of go through this rehabilitation program. And then I thought I'd go back to Vernon in the Okanagan. But then, yeah, I think I took like a bus to Vancouver and went to GF Strong. And then it was just so different than I would have imagined going through this whole rehabilitation program at that age. I spent my 19th birthday in there. Yeah. Yeah, it
Oh,
was surreal. I was like turning 19 in a hospital. But I had some friends in Vancouver at the time, and they like planned a little party for me. It was really cute. They
aw.
planned a little dinner, and like the hospital let me go out, It was near the end of my time there, so I was like more mobile and stuff. But yeah, and then they wanted me at the Young Rheumatic Disease Clinic, the Yard Clinic,
Oh, okay.
young adults with rheumatic disease. So yeah, I like aged out of the youth system. I aged out of the pediatric care system, and then I was just in this new city. Um, it was really hard because people who didn't like I was meeting new people in the city, and most of them were young, creative people or people who moved to the city or were in the city to go to university. And I didn't have a GED, I didn't have a diploma. It was a really weird experience because I was pretty open for a little bit with people, but then I just really kept a lot to myself, and I just kind of like hustled as much as I could to find any type of part-time job because I was on disability, but I could only work really short shifts that weren't on my feet. So I think like when I look, I felt like I was part of this movement or this, kind of like scene, I guess, of young artists, which in a way I was. But now that we're all older, we've all kind of chatted and reflected about it. And they were like, oh, I was just they've like friends have told me, they're like, I was just a young kid, like in my band or going to school. And you literally were just like plopped here by the government and just got out of the hospital and like I was dealing with such a different situation, but I was really happy and I had a lot of fun to be there. But then I think it was hard because I it's hard for me to go back to the Okanagan because of a lot of the bad memories that I have there. But I have so many good ones too. But because I don't really have like a home base there, it's kind of strange. And all my siblings live in different cities.
Okay.
So
Yeah, so there's no like reason to really go back.
yeah, like my grandparents live there, so I will go like once a year, but I haven't seen all my siblings in one place for like 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of siblings, so I
I have
mean,
a lot, yeah.
understandable in a way. So you talked a little bit about how you went to the yard clinic. What was your experience there?
Yeah, so I was sent to the yard clinic after GF Strong, and I think I was really struggling with my identity as a person with disabilities at that time. Um, I think because I was around like all these cool artists and I just wanted to like forget, and I just moved to Vancouver. I didn't know very many people, whereas in my hometown most people like knew that I had these illnesses and stuff, and it was kind of inescapable when I was growing up. Um, but then when I was in the yard clinic, I kind of just like didn't want to go. I didn't go to physio. I just kind of like I stopped taking my medicine. It was a hard time. Yeah, so I dropped out of the yard clinic, and then I was trying to work all these part-time jobs, and I was like getting fired all the time. Like, I'd have like massive flare-ups, and I didn't want to tell my employers what was wrong with me. Um, I was in pretty bad denial. I would like tell really close friends super privately, like, by the way, this is like my backstory. But I really felt like it did me no good to tell people about having rheumatic disease. Like I was like, no good can come of it. No support will come of it. So that was a hard time. And then I think when I was like 24 or 23 or 24, I just couldn't function at all. I was so sick again. So I started going, I was going to like walking clinics for help. And they were like, you need to just like like you need to be in the rheumatological programs. Like, I don't know why you're not. So yeah, then I started seeing Dr. Wade around that time. And then I started going back to Mary Pack Clinic. I think I was like above the age bracket for the yard clinic at that time. How do you know how old the yard clinic goes till now?
I think it's usually like the transition clinics are like 18 to 25.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they just put me into like adult. I think also though part of why I rejected the yard clinic was because I had taken care of myself for so long. So like it was kind of like that in high school too when we took like home ec. I was like, I have a kitchen, I pay rent, I plan my own meals. Why am I in home ec? And like with the yard clinic, I think in a weird way, being around young adults who had more support than me was kind of triggering. Like I didn't really feel like I could connect with my peers. It made me feel more alone because there was no one that I had met, including really the doctors. They didn't really know anyone who was an aged out youth with rheumatic disease. So when I started seeing Dr. Wade, it was actually really nice because he was like, holy moly, you don't have anyone but yourself. You're doing pretty good for that, because he's like seen, he has like a double degree from Harvard. He's like an internal med specialist and a rheumatologist. He's seen tons of people. He was on the board at UBC, VGH. So when I started seeing him, I told him I wanted to be an artist, which is kind of funny. It's funny telling a doctor, right? You're like, I know, you think I'm dumb. Like, but he didn't at all. He was like, that's awesome. Art's amazing. Good for you. And I was like, what? Yeah, he was really encouraging. And he was very like, I don't know. I think I had so much shame when I started seeing him because I had dropped out of the yard clinic. I had like, all of my pediatric specialists who knew my family history, who knew my history in the social system. He didn't know that, so I kind of was like, he's like, "Where's your parents? Why are you like working part time? Like, why like you're on disability? How are you getting by?" Um, so like he asked a lot of psychosocial questions about my diagnosis too, and I just kind of stayed with him from that point on. And honestly, my time at the yard clinic, like I barely remember it.
You kind of mentioned the social aspect of living with a rheumatic disease. When did you start speaking publicly about your rheumatic disease? And also, like, how did people react to when you started to learn how to kind of talk about it and advocate for yourself?
That's a really good question. I'm laughing because I think I had kind of an extreme experience when I started talking about it. Like I said, I was really private. And then when I was trying to go to university, um, like it just wasn't doing me any good how secretive I was about it. So yeah, I think I just had a really unhealthy relationship with disability. I'd always identified as a person who was sick and never as a person who's disabled. I don't know why. So then when I was going to university and just like facing the barriers, the systemic barriers that I kept facing, I started to just feel like I had no options because prior to that, I was having trouble keeping a full-time job. So when I was working, I couldn't work full time. And I was like, oh, if I get an education, then maybe I could teach or do workshops. And I kind of thought that an education would allow me to do less labor intensive jobs because I'd always done like house cleaning, all these labor intensive jobs because I didn't have an education. So then when I started going to university, I was like, oh, these barriers are so systemic. Like it doesn't it doesn't matter like what area of my life I'm in, I'm having trouble getting people to like support me in a way that allows me to support myself, right? Like working, having employment is crucial to supporting yourself, and getting an education again is like really important. And I was having trouble in both, and I had always imagined that the university system would have more education on disability. Like I remember I was taking some social justice classes at Emily Carr, and they just like cruised through the disability portion. There was just so much about other social issues, which are super important, but it was just like painful for me. And especially being a youth in care, like I think it's like something like under 2% of youth in care get a university degree. And then the amount, yeah, it's really low. And then graduation rate for youth in care was about 40% for high school graduation. So so then like I was trying to sort of bring these topics up in class, and I was just so isolated. Like I think when I was young, I thought, oh, when I move to a city, I'll meet more people with experiences like me, more disabled people, more sick people, more people who've had alternative lifestyles, unconventional childhoods. But then when I was in art school, I was like, wow, why do I feel so cornered in all the time? Not to say that there weren't people there who also were experiencing similar things, but I think that the shame and stigma about speaking about it kept us separated. Like if I was speaking about something in class, maybe there were lots of people in there who felt the same way but didn't feel very safe to speak about their experiences. So when I dropped out, I was like, how do I meet people who are like-minded and have similar like ethics and ethos about social progress? And I was like always at home. I was pretty homebound around that time. I was in my late 20s and early 30s, and I was writing lots of poetry and making lots of art. And then I was just like, oh, I'm gonna go on social media. I really didn't like social media. I preferred community connection, But the way that I felt at that time is like I wasn't getting that disability community in the workplace. I wasn't getting it in the art scene. I wasn't getting it in the institutions I was trying to go to, and I had attended a lot of groups with the hospital and stuff, especially for things like mental health, anxiety, PTSD. But even in those groups, they don't encourage you to really mingle outside of the group for confidentiality reasons. So yeah, so I was like, okay, what is my only other option? I'm home all the time. So I just started sharing on social media. And that was really hard. I mean, I did this project called New Psychedelia of Industrial Healing. And I would take these daily, because I was taking daily injections at the time, anakinra. And I would make these like little collages, assemblages, and I would hashtag it like disability celebration, women with disabilities celebration, SJA, rheumatic disease day, and all this stuff. And hashtags really helped me meet people. And I know like there's good things and bad things with social media and hashtags, but as far as rare diseases, it's really hard to meet people in person, like some of the conditions that I have that aren't even rheumatic disease based are like 1 in a million, so it's like you're really not likely to meet those people in person. So I was really looking for people to connect with, and I was speaking out online. But I did lose some friendships, but I gained so many friends who were way more like-minded. I remember I had some friends who I'd known for years, and they were like, "You're really different now." And I was like, well, I'm sharing more about myself that I'd never felt comfortable sharing,
Yeah.
And obviously there's comments like, oh, you're seeking attention, or you want people to, especially when you talk about disability or chronic pain or illness, people really jump to that narrative like, oh, you want pity, or it's like, no, it's just like awareness. How can we be aware? So, but I
Yeah.
made so many, like I know I was actually unpacking yesterday and I found all these letters from people that were like, you helped me speak out. I didn't feel comfortable speaking out. You know, that type of negative backlash, it's like it's always going to happen, but I just didn't care, the way that I felt at that time. I was like, I've heard all these things behind closed doors. I felt these feelings from the institutions I've been trying to contribute to. So whatever, if people are going to say that online, I don't care, because they're going to think it, they're going to say it behind someone's back. But yeah, I met like so many cool people who taught me a lot about activism, because I grew up pretty anarchist and stuff, but I didn't know anything about like actual activism. And I still I'm learning. There's so many different methods of doing it. And I think for myself, I really wanted to like honor my experiences in silence. And so I was like extra loud about it for a while. And then after I got that out of my system, I was like, that project for me, it did what it needed to do. Like it connected me with the people that I want to maintain like friendships with. And it allowed me a space to connect with institutions internationally that believe in disability justice and really want to see change. And it's actually interesting. Emily Carr asked me to come speak for them.
Wow.
Yeah, so I went and did a talk there, and it was really interesting. So there were some people who were like, wow, you told me you were sick, but I didn't think it was so serious. I'm really glad you're doing this. Yeah, like weird stuff like that. And like, I get it. If you don't spell it all out for people,
Yeah.
they can come to their own conclusions. But that's where I think I got really exhausted advocating, is like having to spell things out for people all the time. And like, now I think I'm in a much better place where I don't feel the need to explain these things as much. But I think it's because there are more activists doing explaining too. Like at that time in Vancouver where I was living, I didn't know any disability activists at all. I know that they existed, I just hadn't connected with them yet. And I think like my skill set is better in the sculpture studio and
Yeah.
not online. Like,
Yeah, and you mentioned some really interesting things like hashtags and kind of how much you've grown now and what your journey was like and also the friendship aspect of it. I know it's so challenging, but you end up like gaining friends, losing friends, and you realize like who's there to support you. But I wanted to talk about your initiatives and interests we briefly touched upon. Tell me a little bit about how you display disability in the form of art.
As far as art, like I love to make publications and writing, but I also love physical objects. I think it's really important to take up physical space and take up real estate, whether it's in a gallery or in someone's storage locker who purchases it. Like it's really important for to take up physical space because so many people with disabilities don't have access to public spaces for, logistical reasons and also systemic reasons, interpersonal reasons where they're not comfortable or don't feel safe in public spaces. So for me, making sculptures is really important, but also creating writing and dialogues and a narrative history about disability, like poetry. I think that's really important too. And that can travel through continents a lot easier than sculptures can. But yeah, I work with gelatin a lot. I like to consider our use of animals in medicine a lot in transgenic meds like recombinant DNA therapies, biologics. They use a lot of animal cells, animal research. Um, and I like to think about these different histories of stigma around disability being people being cursed, people having like done terrible things in past lives to be cursed with disability. Like I kind of like to undo these negative narratives about disability and see it as just another way of existing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be so torturous. I like to make sculptures that decompose. That's a really big thing for me, like things that not only reflect the temporality of our bodies and the fragility of our bodies, but also our relationship with nature and the earth. And um, so like the gelatin that I work with, it's a powder, and then I hydrate it and then I dehydrate it. So there's a little bit of this kind of like alchemical aspect where I'm working with different temperatures, and I use like fans and different levels of humidity and stuff like that to um, kind of like I kind of sculpt my sculptures with like air sometimes. I know that sounds weird, but the way that you dehydrate something and the amount of air pressure can make it like warp or stay really still. So I like that my sculptures, they kind of have their own personality behind them. And then they're also petri dishes, like they're all of these galleries are like, how do we deal with this? It's going to like contaminate our historical works in the museum. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, there could be a pathogen in it, there could be a virus in it, there could be bacteria in it. That's how it feels being immunocompromised your whole life. It's complex, and we have to find a way for like bodies to exist in different ways together, and sculptures, different art practices to exist. Like some museums are just like flat out, they don't want gelatin in the museum. But which is ironic because like there is gelatin in a lot of film practices. There's gelatin in some other practices, but they often conservators will like inspect it with a microscope, make sure there's no mold and stuff.
That's very
Because
intense.
it can like destroy other works that are
Okay.
natural.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then I work with paper mache. I really like to use recycled materials, so I make these kind of like metallic wax melting looking like armatures that kind of remind me of like candelabras or stalactites. And I do that with paper mache, um, which is nice. Like both the gelatin and the paper mache, I do them little bits at a time. So it's not heavy, but when the sculpture's done, it's quite heavy. So I usually need help moving things around. I want my work to be accessible. Like I want like a 3-year-old to find it interesting, a 30-year-old and a 90-year-old, Um,
Yeah.
I don't want to make art that's exclusive because I don't want to replicate that exclusivity of disability and non-disabled, Like I want people to feel invited into different aspects of my work and different dialogues around disability, whether it be pain, anxiety, depression, isolation, any aspect, it doesn't necessarily need to be like about disease per se. So I also make memes though, and I like to kind of play with comedy when I can. I mean, a lot of my sculptures are kind of jokey. It's hard not to joke about disability. I mean, like, that's how we cope with it. I
Yeah,
think we all
exactly.
joke a lot. Yeah. But yeah, so I make memes and I try to make those like pretty low barrier.
Okay.
And I also like to write essays and stuff, but I haven't really been doing that very much lately because thinking of my audience, like I said, I really appreciate the academic audience, and I think it's really important to have academic writing around these topics. But I think like as far as social change goes, I would like teenagers to see my work and like younger people. I think that makes a big difference. And then I like older people to see it as well because so many older people are dealing with disability from old age as well. So
Yeah, everyone kind of deals with it at different times. So I love to end off the podcast episode with an advice segment. What advice would you give to your younger self?
I think I would give my younger self the advice to just be a bit more patient. I think I like in wanting to accept reality, I would accept the current reality I was in without really imagining how different things could be. I would kind of submit, I guess, to the isolation or to the stigmas around disability. And I think I would have given the advice to be a bit more hopeful that people can start to see disability differently.
Thank you so much, Sharona, for coming on this week's episode. We discussed your childhood and what it was like to access care from a rural community. We talked further about constantly moving and being raised in the government care as an individual with many chronic illnesses. You dived into the care that you received and how it was really impacted by your living situation. You discussed your support system and what it was like growing up very isolated. Talked a little bit about the transition clinic that you went to. Lastly, wrapped up by discussing how you express your disease through your artwork. So everyone, like, comment, subscribe. I will put a couple links about Sharona and some of the articles that she's been featured in down below, as well as her social medias. And I'll see everyone in 2 weeks on Take a Pain Check. Thank you so much, Sharona. Bye.
Thank you.
I can't hide, 'cause growing pains are keeping me alive.